Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Web Development with ASP.NET with your host, Mr. Nelson LeKay. Nelson!
Hey.
Hey! And also joining us tonight, we've got Mr. Zach Parrish.
Hi.
And myself, Jason Busby. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we are going to take our first look at HTML and CSS. And I say HTML. Let me correct what I just said there. It's going to be XHTML because, Nelson, I don't want you to harp too much on just old HTML. We're just kind of slanting everything more towards XHTML. Is that okay with you, Nelson?
Yeah.
Okay, good deal. So, yeah, it's not going to be some sort of in-depth video on XHTML or CSS. Just kind of a strong refresher with... I'll try to throw out a bunch of questions. Zach, if I can get you to join in and help throw out questions, even if it's things you know, because we've all played with web pages.
Yeah, you know I'm good at that.
So I want to try to cover those out there that may be new to it. Though at the same time, I'm not going to have Nelson break into a 7-hour video
in the beginning
going over the fundamentals. So with that, Nelson, let me hand it over to you.
Well, yeah. So I guess this video. The goal is for you to be comfortable with HTML and the terminology that goes with it, and to give you a few resources to explore more. I guess the idea is while we go through these videos, the complicated CSS and HTML, or XHTML, and I'll get into the difference in a moment, you'll sort of see that as we use it, we'll explain it.
Okay.
And so this is just to give you just an idea of what HTML is and how we can use it to do stuff, and what you should and shouldn't do with it.
And some of the basic terminology that you'll come across.
Yep. So the first site that anyone doing HTML development needs to know is W3Schools.com. And these guys have tutorials, they have references, they have everything about everything there is to know about websites and HTML and JavaScript and CSS. And I use these people as a reference quite regularly in my own work because it's just great to be able to come here and click through and get some good references on all of the stuff that we need. Like, for example, we have a tag list of all the stuff we can use. So with that open, we're going to go ahead and create an HTML file. And now we're just going to create an HTML file. It's not going to be hosted by a web server like we saw with the previous example. So it's just going to be a file on our local file system that Firefox renders by going through the file system, loading up the HTML file directly and rendering it, as opposed to asking a web server to render it for us. So we won't be able to have any dynamic content or database stuff or whatever. This is just to give you the idea, or just give you a foundation in HTML. So in order to do that, we just need to go ahead and create a file, any file, and we're going to name it index.html. The HTML extension is important. And then we're going to just drag it over onto Firefox. We get a blank page, and then we're going to drag it over into Visual Studio so we can do editing. Now, just a quick thing, we're going to be using Visual Studio as the editor, because that's eventually what we're going to be using to edit all of our HTML, but any editor with syntax highlighting for HTML you can use. Please don't use Notepad, because Notepad doesn't have syntax highlighting, and you will miss quotations, you will miss tags that don't line up properly. So go out, and if you don't own Visual Studio, go out and try the Notepad++, Programmer's Notepad, Notepad 2, any of those derivatives to be able to write HTML effectively. So
now, Nelson, with all of our member sponsors out there that are watching this video, let's just assume that there's one that's completely new to web development. So the first thing, probably not a bad idea just to tell them that HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Now, when they hear the word language, we need to quickly dispel the idea that it's a programming language. It's not a programming language, is it?
No, it's a markup language.
Okay.
HTML, HTML started out, hypertext markup language. The idea of hypertext was text that could link to other pages, and that's the World Wide Web, which started out with a scientist at CERN named Tim Burton-Lee in 1991, is when the first web browser and web server was created. And he envisioned this really awesome like interactive book style thing where we could format text and click through to other links and everything. But it's grown so much since then that a lot of things have changed. And even in the past 5 years, a lot of things have changed. So, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So we're going to start writing a HTML document or an XHTML document. And the first thing we need to do is add a doctype. And I have not committed the doctypes to my memory because they're long and annoying. So I'm going to go ahead and use W3 Schools as a crutch to grab the doctype that I want.
Now, while you're grabbing one, can I toss this out there? You don't have to use that. Meaning, now you do, yes, with where we're taking things. But if you don't add that in, and you put HTML tags in here, and use things like H1, etc., you will see what's going to appear to be proper functionality when you render out the page, right?
Exactly. What happened was during the first browser war between Netscape and Internet Explorer and all those people back way before I was using the internet in the 90s, they had HTML was developing. People were using it for things it was never intended to, but for good reason. They were making some really cool stuff. So these browsers, they each had their own little dialect of HTML, and that had to become standardized. So the W3C got together and said, we're going to standardize HTML, and every browser that renders HTML needs to conform to these standards. But they didn't want to break all of these sites that worked long before in Netscape and Internet Explorer or early versions of Internet Explorer.
Right.
So they introduced these doctypes, and these doctypes instruct the browser to render your content in a certain way. That's basically all they do, and there's a bunch of different...
Without a doctype, now I may be wrong with this. It just seems like this is something that I heard at one point. Without a doctype there, doesn't it each browser revert back to, I believe it was called Quirk mode?
Quirks mode, yes.
Yeah, with the exception of, I think it's Opera. But meaning it's going to go back to its own way of how it handled, back in the old days, rendering of that content, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And should you use the doctype? Yes, you should.
Oh,
should
absolutely.
Always use a doctype. Just don't think about starting a page without using a doctype. Any of these doctypes will be fine. But we're going to choose XHTML strict. And I'm going to copy this in here and explain what exactly XHTML is. So we have this HTML language, and I'm going to just hammer out a quick page. Okay, so this is a quick HTML page, and the thing about HTML is that when it was originally conceived, the attitude was that HTML should be simple, people shouldn't have to learn rules, they should be able to type it however they want to. And that became a huge, huge problem, especially with browsers trying to interpret all these weird different ways you can write HTML. And I'm not exactly sure when XML came out. I'm not sure if it was before or after HTML. Maybe you have, Jason?
Actually, no. I do not know exactly when.
I've honestly never thought about this before, but...
Pause the video. If you're watching, just pause the video, pump that into Google, and then you'll know.
Okay, so XML either existed before or after HTML did, and it looks a lot like HTML, but it has rules, and it has rules that cannot be broken. And I'm just going to type some random stuff and just to give you an idea of what is valid and what isn't.
Which also brings up the next website you're going to want to show them in a minute.
Yep.
I think Nelson's thinking, what website's that? The Validator.
Oh, yes.
He was thinking that. Awesome. That was epic.
You'd hear the leaves burning.
Yeah. So we're going to bring up the validator in a second, but
yeah.
This is valid HTML. This is invalid XHTML because XHTML is HTML with XML rules, and this line and this line both violate XHTML rules because this has a p tag without an ending p tag. This has an option tag without an ending option tag, and this has an attribute without a value. And these are all invalid XML and thus invalid XHTML. And let me go ahead and show you guys the validator. So the validator.w3.org is an online tool that will validate your HTML markup against whatever doctype you put up here. So in this case, that validator is going to detect that we're on XHTML 1.0 strict, and that's going to validate all of our document against that standard. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this into the direct input and check it. And we'll see a lot of errors. And it'll let us know that, yeah, I forgot that, but I'll get into that in a second. It'll let us know that it can't understand this because we don't have a value, there's no ending of option, and there's no end tag for P. And this XML namespace declaration right here is very important in XML to be valid XML because every XML document needs to be able to identify itself. And that's what this namespace means up there. This namespace means that all of the following nodes are part of this namespace, and this namespace is an arbitrary URL picked by the W3C.
Okay. So what does that mean to somebody who has never heard the term namespace before, and you've suddenly added this in as an attribute with a value into the HTML tag? What does it mean, and what does it do?
This is a way to conform against XML. So that's because XHTML is XML, we have to write this in. And the XML namespace, XML and S, is you define this on your root node, and it says that every node or tag and every attribute of those tags or nodes needs to conform to whatever specification this defines, this namespace. And in this case, this is an arbitrary URL that the W3C chose. But I think, I've never actually gone here before.
You're probably the first person in history to go there.
Not at the very bottom, number of visitors, 1.
Okay, so we have a, we get back to the spec. And
oh, wow, what was the date? That's brand new.
The what? Yeah, it's a W3C recommendation. And you'll probably spend a lot of time
23rd of November, just a few days ago.
In these specs, and they're really cool and interesting and pretty dry. But
wait a minute, you said pretty cool, interesting, and dry.
But that is cool to Nelson.
That's like
they're important to read about the what we should be doing with XHTML and HTML. But ultimately, this particular resource will give you a better tutorial format.
Sure.
It's basically this distilled.
But I have to go back to the namespace. So I understand that it's required, but why? The browser is not using it, is it? Or is it?
Well, I want to say yes and no, and that has to do with the content type that you deliver XHTML in. Okay. But that's kind of beyond the scope.
I know that's fair enough. That's fair enough. I'm like I said, I'm just going to poke around with questions that I would ask if I was in a class.
The reason why we have to put this in here is, well, like I said, every XML document is self-aware. It knows what nodes are valid inside of itself. And that's determined by this XML namespace up here. And this XML namespace is used by it's also used by your editor. And Visual Studio knows that we're writing HTML, so because we're a .html.
Now that makes, again, playing the role of a student, that makes sense to me. So then your editor could pick up on that and utilize
if you're using
that.
a pure XML editor,
correct.
Which we're not in this case. We're using an editor aimed towards HTML.
Okay.
But yeah. Okay, so that is that part of it, and now we can make these valid again by adding that, by adding this, and by adding that.
Now, when working with XHTML strict, we're case sensitive now, right? When we're in XML world.
We are case sensitive. And a quick thing to know about XHTML is that we're probably never going to use true XHTML throughout this course. And the reason is that, well, there are a lot of practical reasons about this, but the difference is that we are serving this content as HTML, and that's what the browser sees and renders and does and everything. It's not really rendering it as XML. If we were to be really true and conformant, we would be submitting this information to the browser as XML, in which case every instance of invalid XML will actually break the browser. And I can't show you a demo of this without a web server. But just know that if you serve with the content type of text XML, the browser itself will break and refuse to render anything that isn't 100% conformant, which is fine, except for Internet Explorer completely doesn't know how to do anything with text XML. So the point is completely moot, and you'll want to serve out with text HTML anyway, which means that the browser will ultimately render this with a weird sort of HTML hybrid. But the important thing to know is that your document should always validate against the W3 Validator. And in this case it doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't, yeah, I have to remove this guy. He's on the properly nested tag. Because this validator not only determines if your code is valid XML, it also determines that you're using the proper or valid elements, and it also makes sure that you're using the proper elements within the correct context.
Gotcha.
So in that case, it was telling me that that select shouldn't be under body; it should be under a form or another block level element. But so yeah, so now it validates.
So I do see you got a couple of warnings there.
Yeah, what's it unhappy about? Okay,
the first thing is that there's no character encoding declared at the document level, and this is another thing that I haven't really committed to memory. I encourage you to read this tutorial on character encoding. That's not the right one. This is the right one. This will go over character encoding, why it's important, why you should care, and all that stuff. And there's a bunch of different ways to set character encoding. And the easiest way is to copy and paste some HTML into the head, which I'm just going to steal from this page.
Awesome.
And yes, I do this, and it's terrible. But,
up to the meta, I would assume.
Yeah, there we go. And this is what we want. We want the char set of UTF-8.
Okay.
So I'm just going to yank that. And this would be set actually by our web server. So that's another important thing to know. Because we're not using HTTP, we're using file.
Now, with a lot of the HTML editors that are out there, I take it that when you create a new page, a lot of this is going to be filled in for you automatically to start with.
Yes, but it might be complete garbage.
Okay.
And that comes into, once I get a total green light from Zach, who seems to not be content until I have 0 warnings.
Just saying. I mean, I'd be curious.
I wanted to offer cookies.
There's still one warning left, though. We're close. We're closer.
This is because we're using the direct input mode.
Okay.
If we were using an HTTP request, it would be different.
What do you say it okay for? Are you talking about because of the scheme?
No, because of the... But yeah, because of the protocol. You can't determine if this is actually being served out through
UTF-8. I see what you're talking about. Okay, yeah, cool.
Okay. So the different doc types. We have HTML4, strict. This is good. If you want to use HTML and you don't want to worry about XML, which I kind of discourage, but if that's what you want to do, use strict. Transitional is stuff that... Transitional lets you use tags that have long since been replaced by CSS.
Deprecated tags.
Yes. So you do not want to use transitional. Frame set? No.
Wait, where's my sign, Nelson?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, frame. If you just absolutely must use deprecated tags, please make sure it's not frame set.
Exactly. And the same thing goes for XHTML. We have strict transitional frame set, and then we have XHTML 1.1 strict. And to be honest with you, I don't know the difference between HTML 1.0 and 1.1. I always use 1.0 because that's what I see everywhere. And another quick note is that there is not going to be an XHTML5. XHTML has been disbanded by the W3C, and that's kind of a depressing note, but it is true. So the thing about what we do here is that when we want to use HTML5, we will replace this with the HTML5 Doctype. And again, HTML5, if you haven't heard all the buzz about it, it's the new standard of HTML that's coming out. We could use the...
But isn't that possibly still quite some ways away, even though we're starting to see browsers that now support it?
It is some ways away, and I could swear that is the correct... I just don't commit these to my memory because Google is just so much closer. It's Doctype HTML. This is going to be the HTML5 Doctype. So notice that this isn't XHTML because there is no XHTML5. So what do you want to do when you are OCD like every other web developer and you need to have matching tags and all this stuff, and you really want to use XML in HTML because, well, quite frankly, it's better. It's easier to parse. It's easier on the tooling. It's easier on the developer. You can use both XHTML and HTML with an HTML5 Doctype.
Cool.
So that's a quick note, because this is invalid XHTML but is valid HTML.
Right.
This is invalid HTML but valid XHTML. Both of these will work under this Doctype, and I can show you by validating against it. And this always has the final word say in anything that has to do with validation. And of course it isn't valid because I have this XML namespace declaration, which I'm sorry.
No, that's good.
No worries. That's why you have the validator.
Yeah, I like actually seeing the validator pointing these things out.
Hold on, bad content type for attribute.
Oh, go to your meta line.
My meta line, yeah.
Hang on.
What doesn't it like about this dude?
Look at your quotes. That's another thing about XHTML. You got to have quotes around your values. So content in the quote after the text /HTML.
Yeah, it's all quoted.
Oh, wait a minute. No. Hang on. Yeah, it is.
Let me read this, because knowing how to read these is good. Bad value content type for attribute. It doesn't like the content type attribute for some reason.
That you copied from their site?
Yeah, but they weren't using the HTML5 Doctype.
Oh, that's a good point. Fair enough.
Yeah, so let's just nuke this guy, just for now, just for demonstration purposes.
That's what I'm saying.
I wasn't going to go over this particular thing. It's kind of terrible. This is actually one of the first times I have used an HTML5 Doctype. So excuse my crutch here.
No crutch.
Again, we're using experimental feature, no character encoding, define a document level using direct input mode. Okay, and then if we wanted to use the HTML5, or the HTML version of that, this will still work. So basically, if you're really, that didn't work. Because
that was epic.
Required character found O, expected R. What does that even
Wow,
mean?
it wants you to spell body birdie, apparently.
Bodie.
Maybe it really didn't like this. Why would it be validating against that? Maybe it's because I had this XML namespace declaration again. God. I wish I came into this video more prepared about HTML5.
Oh, come on. These are relaxed, informal, and we're just, this should pass.
Well, you'll also notice
Booyah.
when you scroll down that it says this is an experimental.
Yeah, that is probably... Yeah, removing the XML namespace declaration fixed the error.
I wouldn't beat myself up
So,
too much.
no, not at all, because you proved what you were saying, that the two different uses of the BR tag worked in the two different ways, in the opposite Doctypes where they would be invalid, but with HTML5, both ways are valid. Yep.
And so we see that this is valid. But you still want to use this, and I'm just going to say you want to use this because I just like it more, and it's better for the tooling and everything, even if you're using HTML5.
Just make sure you have that space before the /.
Yeah, definitely. But I'm going to go ahead and undo all this and give us back our XHTML, because that is what I write in every day, and I'll have less embarrassing moments with this.
And real quick, I just want to add in again for the one person out there that's completely new to web development, with HTML, you don't always have to have closing tags. It's kind of like the guy that's just chilled back in Jamaica. He's enjoying the sun. It's a nice day on the beach. And with XHTML, you've got to have both the opening and a closing tag. It's more like your military marine officer, and everything is perfect.
Well, I always remembered it with XHTML. XHTML was like HTML with standards.
Yes. That's pretty much what it is. And so now that we have that,
XHTML has got the guy out front with you're not getting in with those shoes.
So before we dive much further, because the term's been tossed around a couple of times, and I think everybody may have picked up on it, but there's three things, three principal components that are going to be mentioned quite a bit as you start working your way, or three principal types, and that's our elements, our attributes, and our values when we work our way through these HTML files. So go ahead and again, we're just accommodating those that may be completely new to working with HTML. So go ahead and talk about, let's start with the element.
Okay, an element or a tag known in HTML as a tag is anything that goes in here and ends like that.
And everything in between as well.
Yeah, that's the children of that element.
The content.
Contents, yeah. So let's put in a valid one. So let's put in H1. So H1 is a tag, and this content is being surrounded by the H1 tag. Now we can give this H1 tag more meaning by adding attributes. And let's just add an attribute. So an attribute is anything inside of these little brackets here. And then all attributes in XHTML, not necessarily for HTML, but for XHTML, have to have a name, a equal sign, and a value surrounded by matching quotes. And what I mean by matching quotes is that this is valid as well as this.
So if you use it on one side, just use the same thing on the other.
Yes. So that is the element, attribute, and value. So this is the value, this is the attribute, and this is the element.
Okay, and values will come in different flavors.
Yeah, there'll be a bunch of different. Well, when we go into the actual meaning of each one of these tags, they'll become more apparent.
Yeah, for sure.
But okay, so what exactly is HTML? We kind of already answered that question, but what do we do with it? And I want to bring up a website that illustrates this point. Okay, CSS Zen Garden, and this gets into CSS, which we're not defining, so instead we're just going to go ahead and view page source. And what do we get? We get, well, content. And, hold on, let me find one. Semantics. And what I mean by content semantics is that your document is going to be a document. Like think about a Word document without any formatting. It's going to be the content of whatever you're trying to express, in addition to the semantics that tell the browser and search engines, more importantly, or maybe about the same importance, what to expect and what type of content that you're putting in.
Okay. So it's like basically the information that'll be on the page, and then a definition of what type of information that is.
Exactly. And we have some principal ways to describe what type of information we're working with. And these are the H1 through H6 tags.
Does H have a meaning, or is it just a random letter of the alphabet?
H stands for header.
Okay.
And we have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6 all have lower weights. So think about like the contents of a book. So you would have the title of the book.
And you're using weight with W-E-I-G-H-T, like lifting weight, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure, because when you say it out loud, it's, sometimes it gets misinterpreted.
Yep. And it's important that you have only one H1 tag in your entire document, and that H1 tag is the same as your title.
Okay.
Then we might have...
Now, is that just a general rule defined by W3, or...?
I don't know if it's a rule defined by W3, but it is searched for by search engines.
Okay.
They will look at that.
Okay.
So yeah, you always want to make sure, and you always want to make sure that there's one H1 in your document. Well, yeah, that's what you said. So we have title of the book, and then chapter 1, which is an H2. And then we have the P tag.
Recheck that closing tag on your H1.
Yep.
Here we go.
Okay, so we have the P tag. And the P tag stands for paragraph. And the paragraph is a bunch of text that, is just a bunch of text separated by margin. And it's also important to note that HTML and XHTML are not white space sensitive, meaning that all of these spaces that are appearing here are ignored.
Okay.
So if I want to demonstrate that, we'll open up this page for the first time and see this. So we see that those new lines were ignored.
Right.
And then we can continue on our structure of the document. And this is HTML. And then we have a few additional tags that we can use. We have 3 types of lists we can use to define our content. We have the unordered list, we have the ordered list, then we have the definition list. Unordered list is, think of it like a bulleted list. Every child under the unordered list must be an LI, or list item. Unordered list is the same way, but think of an ordered list as a numbered list. Again, every child must be an LI.
And you don't specify a number there, it's just the order in which you put them in?
Exactly. The definition list, think of it like terms and definitions. And one term can have multiple definitions. And we'll show that to you because we have 2 child elements that we can put under a DL. And that's DD for definition and DT for definition term. So we'll put DT HTML and then DD and there you go. And then we can also have multiple definitions under a single term. And now we can show you, and again, I don't really like bringing up the browser and showing you what it looks like, because that's not what matters here. What matters is that we're describing content, and we're giving that content meaning. And we're doing that with HTML, and that's what HTML does. And if you talk to any modern designer or developer who works with HTML, they'll agree that the #1 goal of an HTML document is to express as much meaning as possible using the built-in tags and using as little, I guess you could say, cruft as possible to sort of shoehorn it into some sort of design.
Yeah, but you better open up the browser. I want to see what those
I was going to say, just go ahead and
do.
open up the browser anyway, even though you don't want to. Actually, it's good because it helps illustrate the point, because obviously, you know, this is not what you want your websites to look like. And
Exactly.
while I know that, you know, we really don't want to get into the way HTML used to be, I know that, but there was a time and a place when the design aspect of things was handled inside of HTML, and it's not that way anymore. These days, this is what HTML delivers, just the content of your web page. It's not even really formatted all that heavily. It's just some basic definitions for how that information should be displayed at a really, really basic level. The way your web page looks is going to be handled separately via CSS, which we only just vaguely touched on because we went to CSS Zen Garden.
And before people come up and say, well, Zach, look at this awesome site, how can it be done in pure HTML? Watch this. View, page style, no style. Did that just blow your mind?
It did. My mind is so blown.
Thanks, Nelson. Now I've got to clean all this stuff off me.
Yeah.
Zach's mind is all over the place.
Okay, but go to any modern website that wasn't designed by somebody in the 90s and go to view page style and hit no style. And this is what you should see, because this is what Google sees. This is what your browser sees. This is what everyone who isn't human sees on your website. And there's so much meaning being expressed here, and that's what we want to do in our code. We want to express all the meaning with our HTML.
Right.
But not much more. We'll go into some instances where that's not entirely possible to leave all unnecessary things out, but we can mitigate that to a huge degree. Okay, I guess the one last tag that we could go over or 2 last tags, the table and the anchor.
Okay.
Now I really don't like the table. See, I do and I don't.
It's got its place.
He was kind of hesitant when he said it, too. It's just like, we got to go over the table.
The reason I don't like tables very much is because before CSS was created, they were the only way to format your document.
Right.
And it was terrible. It was terrible.
So are you saying you don't like them because of their history? They have a bad reputation?
I don't like saying the word table.
Ah.
I like when you're using them for tabular data, like what you would put in an Excel spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only way to do it. If you try to do that with CSS and generic elements like ULs and LIs, you would run into a corner because tables handle that particular instance really well. But they should never be used for design. Even if you want to split your site into 2 columns, if you put it in your table, you should really think about learning CSS and using CSS instead of going back to using tables, because I mean, design should be as far abstracted away from your content as possible.
I thought Nelson was about to say, you should turn in your developer card right now.
Get off the internet right now.
See, the thing is I've known a lot of developers who are great developers who just never learned CSS, and they continue to use tables, and then someday someone was like, hey, you should learn CSS, and they learned CSS, and it was great, and they used it afterwards. I'm not saying that if you use tables in your design, you're stupid or wrong. I'm just saying I absolutely guarantee you that if you learn CSS, you will not use tables in your designs ever.
Thought he was about to say, I absolutely guarantee you you're
that
stupid.
You're stupid and you're wrong.
Okay, I just don't want to offend a bunch of people out there who just haven't learned any other way.
Just encourage them to learn another way.
Yes, and I can through experience, through my experience of working with people who haven't learned CSS, from my experience of maintaining old websites, that tables
you can do it.
Will destroy.
Oh, you're supposed to just stand up and say, I can tell you from experience, I used to be a table user.
No. See, the thing is I learned web programming after CSS came out, so I had all these people. Yeah, exactly. So I had all these people telling me, don't do it this way, do it this way. And that's how I learned from the start. And I imagine it would be very difficult for a web designer who's been working in HTML for 10 years to be able to learn CSS, but I guarantee you it's worth it.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Period. Okay. So table. So how do we display tabular data? So we have an Excel spreadsheet and we want to render it in HTML in some sort of way. So we would do it by writing the table. And the table has bunch of different stuff. We have the T-head, the T-body, and the T-foot, and I'm not going to go over these guys right now. But so we have the TR, and that stands for table row. And you can imagine that a table row is a table row. And then we have the TD, and I'm not exactly sure what the D means, but you can think of a TD as a cell. So this has a single row with 2 cells in it, and we can see it by going to our site and seeing cell 1, cell 2.
Well,
and then
we might have. Recording at 10 frames a second,
yeah,
you may have actually been on that page for a second.
Okay.
Ah, there. Okay.
So we see cell 1 and we see cell 2.
Okay.
And let's say we want to add headers to this table. Okay. We do that by adding another row and doing table header. The Alt tab doesn't work through TeamViewer, and I just have this thing where the second I'm writing HTML in kind of like a really really fast, the second I finish, I hit Control S, Alt Tab F5.
Right.
And I just can't turn that off.
Do you Alt Tab in on your computer when you do that?
Yeah, it brings up this little dialog box. It's annoying. So those are tables.
So what do the headers look like?
They are bold.
Okay, I'm sorry. You're just so fast. I didn't even see it that time.
Making sure everybody got to see.
Cool.
And remember, again, this doesn't matter what it looks like. Get this out of your mind. Just see the.
But if you're displaying tabulature data, can't you use stuff with the table to make some lines appear around it?
Yeah, we can make lines appear. We can change background colors. We can do everything with CSS that we could possibly need to do.
Okay.
With actually the exception of 2 attributes, which I'll get into later.
But Nelson, why does this website look so poor?
See, this website isn't. It's rich in content. See, we have a title of a book.
I was just razzing you, man. Just razzing you.
No, man.
A table.
It is.
A chapter 2.
Yeah.
And a bunch of lists.
This book is black and white, straightforward.
Yeah.
Rich with content.
Exactly. And it's also rich with semantic meaning, because a search engine can look at this and say, I know exactly what everything means. And that is what you want to try to achieve with HTML. So the next thing that the last tag that we're going to talk about is the anchor. And that's the A tag. And the A tag, the most important attribute of the A tag is the href. And so what an A tag is it's a link. Or, well, it could be used as a link if you had the href attribute on it. So let's fill in this href with a page that doesn't exist yet, about.html. And we're going to come down here and copy and paste this guy. And call him about.html.
.html. It's our own special markup language.
Okay, and then we're going to drag that into Visual Studio successfully. And then we're going to say, I don't know, link back to index.html. So now we have these 2 links. So remember, anchor for A, href, hypertext reference is what I like to think about it, but I'm not sure if that's actually what it expands to. I just think hypertext reference. And then a link, and then a title or the content of this link. And if we look at it in the browser, we get a link to another page. And we click on it, and we go to that other page. And then we can click on this link and go back and forth. And links are pretty much the most fundamental concept of HTML.
Now
and
you're linking relative in this case here.
Yes, I am. Because I'm not supplying a / or a protocol. This is going to be relative to whatever current directory we're working in.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, that's links, tables, paragraphs, headers, lists. Those are pretty much the building blocks of pretty much any web page you can think of. And if you probably don't believe me right now, if you don't know CSS, you probably don't believe me that this more or less, and I'll get into that in a sec, can represent a completely well-designed website by just changing CSS.
Because the well-designed part comes separately.
Exactly. And I guess we also have to go into 2 more tags. These
don't
tags,
hurt yourself,
I don't think
buddy.
he's happy about
No,
these
I really
2
don't
tags.
think he's all that thrilled about these tags.
the reason why I'm not thrilled about these tags is they are introduced as the first thing anyone learns about CSS. And they are overused everywhere. And the reason why they're overused is because they have no semantic value. They essentially provide hooks into our website to style, but they don't actually provide any semantic value to the browser or to a search engine.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
So that's why I kind of don't like these guys, because they could be overused, but they are absolutely necessary to do certain things. And these two tags are called the div or divider and the span. Think of a span as a span of text.
I'm shocked that you don't like those tags.
Well, they're necessary. I have to use them.
They're critical.
But every time I put in a div, I am putting HTML in my document that has no meaning.
From a content point of view, yes.
And I'll use them a lot, and you'll see me use them a lot because they're absolutely necessary. But the search engines will look at this div and ignore it.
But I mean, aren't you also providing a way to kind of guide your CSS around? I mean, you're setting up the groundwork that your CSS is going to tie into to place your design, yeah?
Exactly. Yes, that is why they exist. But they can be overused, and they will be overused, and I've seen them overused.
But that means you really just don't like the people that overuse them, not so much the tags.
Okay, so what is a div? What is a span? A div is a divider, meaning that it's a block level element. And we'll get into what a block level element is. But think of it like a p tag. It will create a line break at the top and the bottom, so it has a margin. A span is a span of text. It is an inline element. And we can wrap any text with a span, and we can wrap any text with a span, and it will continue to flow as normal. And we can look at that and see that yes, this continues to flow. So yeah, so those are the divs and the spans. We'll be using them a lot, but I just want to say that if you can do something with fewer divs and spans, then you should. I guess that's all I'm going to say about those guys for now.
Yeah, but we're going to be coming back to them a lot.
Yes. Okay, so, well, we have this content and we have semantic meaning, and that's all great from, a purist sort of search engine way, but we want to be able to style things to make things look good. And that's where CSS comes in. And CSS is a language, it's a domain-specific language, or DSL, that is either embedded into HTML or provided in a separate document that provides the style information to the browser in order to render this page in pretty much any way we want. And I'll demonstrate that by heading over to CSS Zen Garden. This is perhaps the best example of CSS being used. And the cool thing is as I click through these little designs, and I clicked on the wrong one. As I click through these designs, know that the XHTML of this page is not changing. The only thing that has been changing while I've been clicking through is the CSS.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's a great example.
And that is CSS that hopefully I can't teach it all in one episode, obviously, because it's huge and it's pretty complicated, but once you know the basics, you have the foundation to kind of expand on that.
Right.
And we're definitely going to be expanding on it in the future when we do things like, we need to flow elements to the left and stuff like that. We'll talk about CSS as it comes up. But how do you add CSS to an HTML document? There are 3 ways to do that. The first way is terrible, and you should never, ever do this. The second way is a little bit more palatable, especially for a training video. Were you laughing?
A little, yeah.
This is a great choice in words.
It's the way you express yourself. It's like I could actually sense you getting physically ill at the thought of somebody doing this.
Okay. And the third method is the way you should probably do it in production sites for various reasons that we'll get over, or go over. And the first way is using the style attribute. And the style attribute lets us type in CSS. So here's an example of a CSS, piece of CSS, I don't know, I guess you could call it code. It's not markup. It's a declarative language, so it is code, I guess you could say. But that is a piece of CSS that is being embedded into this one element, this H1 element, in this one particular instance, and will never be reused again.
Right.
So
that's a key thing.
We can see that
is breaking the whole idea of keeping your content separate from your design.
Exactly. And I'm really sad to admit this, but I have used this in production hotfixes before, and I absolutely hate the fact that the W3C has allowed this to continue. Because I have found myself using this, and it's terrible, and you should never use it, because it's so quick and easy, but it will introduce the exact same problems that the old way of writing or designing websites had. So just avoid this at all costs. The next way is using a tag at the top of or at the head element of your document. That's the style tag. The style tag, in order to be standard, requires the type attribute to be text/CSS. And inside of this, we can put a combination of 2 things: a selector and a group of attributes, key value pairs, I guess you could say, into each selector. So what is a selector? A selector is, well, it's a way to define what elements you are going to select. It's a way to define a criteria. And this is the simplest selector that we have, is the element selector. And that's when you just type in an element name, and then you add curly braces, and you start putting in attributes. So what this reads as is select every element, or every H1 element in our document, and apply the color blue attribute, or CSS attribute, to it. And if we look at this, we will see the result is the exact same as before.
Change it to red. Prove to him that it's working. Yeah.
So yeah. And then we can also do p tags and, you know, whatever you want to do.
So I mean, what's our limitation as far as...
I mean, yeah, do you have to assign these based on the element? Can you narrow it down
Well,
even further?
I know we can narrow it down, which is going to be shown in a moment, but I'm thinking like how you have H1, so we're matching the H1 element. I mean, do you have things like TR or TH or...
Yes. Every single element that is inside of HTML, including elements that you can define that aren't even part of the spec, will usually be stylable from here. So all the ones in the spec are, all the ones outside of the spec, if you're doing something crazy, probably will be depending on your browser, but you should never do that anyway.
Okay.
So,
okay.
yeah, so we could say table, and then we can say width 100%, and then we get the width being 100%.
Oh, nice.
Okay, so we have the basic element selector. There are a bunch of selectors to go through, and I'm going to do the...
Bunch of different selector types.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to do the Descendant Selector first. So let's say we wrap some text in this paragraph with a span, which is valid and is fine to do, I guess. But and then we also do it here because we want to drive our developer particularly crazy. So we have that, and we want to be able to determine if a span is in a p tag or if a span is in an h2 tag. So here is the Descendant Selector. The Descendants.
Can I? Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So what exactly is the span going to give us? Why would you even have it in there?
Oh, absolutely nothing. This provides no semantic or formatting value to the document whatsoever until we apply some to it.
Okay. In the form of attributes and values?
In CSS, yes.
In CSS, okay. So within the span tag itself. I mean, can you do something right there to demonstrate?
You just want me to use an element selector on this guy? Or
I was just thinking with the span itself, something down there where you've got it in line to demonstrate how you could use it with CSS to affect the chapter 2.
You mean with style?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, but again, this is going down a long,
I understand.
terrible road that you will never recover from. And when developers are maintaining your sites, years and years and years down the line, they will hate you for it. And we can see that. Okay, and just a quick note, this H2 is not being selected. I'll select it up here. Just a quick note, style overrides all. The style attribute will always override whatever your CSS says.
Another reason not to do this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so let's nuke that guy, and let's say that we only want to select spans that are inside of p tags.
Okay.
So let's introduce the Descendant Selector. So we start off selecting all p tags, and then we hit space, and we want to select all span tags that are at some point a descendant of that p tag.
So now as descendant, it doesn't mean it has to be a child necessarily, just a descendant.
Just at some point a descendant. I could nest this, and well, I can actually with the I can do this, the emphasis tag.
Okay.
And so yeah, so this will still match because this is at some point a descendant of this p tag.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Or of any p tag. It's not that p tag particularly. So if we show you this, we should get a blue background right there on that span.
Mm-hmm.
Next thing to show is the, I don't know what this is called. I don't even know if it really is a selector, but it's a way to define multiple selectors on one pair of key value pairs, and that's with comma. So let's say we want to select all spans that are at some point descendants of P of a paragraph, and we want to select all H2 tags. So we do comma and then another selector. This isn't limited to the element selector. This is whatever selector we want. And we come here, and we get that.
Now change the text to white. Awesome.
Very nice.
There you go.
Pretty straightforward.
Yep. And the next selector we could go over is the direct descendant selector. And it looks just like the descendant selector, except for it has this little greater than sign right here. And it says every span that is a direct descendant of P, of a P tag. And I'll show you that right here. This span is not a direct descendant of this P tag.
Okay.
However, this span is. And if I can just get my cursor, there we go. And if we refresh, there we go. This one gets selected. This one does not get selected.
So direct descendant. So basically, as long as
Next
it's a child.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So many different ones.
What if you wanted to select a particular span, like one that you actually have to call specifically?
Okay, that gets into classes and IDs. And every element in HTML, including body, can have a class or can have an ID and or multiple classes. And an ID is what you give to an element that should never occur again in the entire website.
So an ID is unique.
Yes. And ID tags are kind of dangerous, but they're kind of good at the same time, because sometimes you will have a situation where you think you're working in something unique, but then eventually turns out you're not.
How does that
However,
spell checker work?
Yeah.
Well, he's just saying unq. That's not unique. That's unq.
Oh.
Okay, so we have this P tag with an ID of whatever, and it will be unique in the entire document. We can also give elements, any element we want, classes. And classes are another attribute on this element, and they are not unique. And also classes are separated by spaces. You can have more than one class on a single element.
Yes, curious, because it looked like you had one class named 1, 2, 3, but that's actually 3 separate classes?
Yes.
Okay.
And then so we have another class sharing, or another element sharing this class. And so how do we select them? If we come up here, there are two selectors that we need. The one is the ID selector, which starts with a hash. And this will select anything with an ID of whatever. And the next selector is the class selector, which starts with a dot. And this will select any element that has this one particular class associated with it. And if we come over here, we get a bunch of weird stuff.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Now, is there ever a circumstance where something might go in front of that dot?
Yes, there are two you can combine these guys with pretty much anything you want. So let's say that we want to only apply to spans. So we're putting another selector in front of this selector.
So it'd be like any span that has the class of 1 is going to get this style.
Yes.
Okay.
So if we put this one class on another element that's not a span, it won't get selected.
Very nice.
And we can see that right there. Another thing is you can also combine the class selectors. So we can say only elements that have the 1 and the 2 class. And we now get that. Or that, sorry.
Gotcha.
Okay, so there's that guy, and the principle also applies here, but this is pretty pointless because I mean, an ID is unique. You should only have one element, and if you don't know what that element type is, then, I mean...
I understand.
What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
Turn in your developer card.
So, yeah.
Now, this only shows two of the ways. We had the inline way, and then we've got this section where we had the style block. But you said there were 3 ways to apply CSS?
Yes, the third way is with an external CSS file. And we do that by coming in here and creating a new file, and we're going to call this site.css. We're going to open it up with Visual Studio. Then we're going to come in here and we're going to copy and paste all this code or all this style information out into here. And remember that anything that is valid in that style attribute will be valid inside of the CSS file.
Okay.
And the way we link it the way we associate this CSS file with this HTML file is to use the link tag with the rel, and I don't know, relation maybe, I think, of style sheet with an href of the location of the style sheet that you want, and then make sure it's a self-closing tag. And then we need, of course, the type, which is text CSS. And we have now linked a style sheet of site.css to this document, and we can prove that it still works by coming in here and refreshing.
Now, just to show the difference, can you go ahead and just temporarily delete out that line you just put and then save the page out, just so we can see that that actually worked? Ah, cool.
Yep. And I mean, there are a lot of different selectors that we can use. There are pseudo selectors. There's so much you can do with CSS, but
Well,
I'm afraid that it'll probably become more apparent once we start actually, building sites that matter.
right, and obviously we haven't created anything that looks half as nice as any of the examples on like CSS Zen Garden, so clearly there's a long way you can go.
For those that may be wondering, what does CSS stand for? Cascading Style Sheets?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
where does that come from?
The cascading part comes from if I were to select this UL. So let's select a UL with the class of 1. And I were to say color blue. And you notice that there's actually no text under this guy. What am I setting blue of? What am I setting blue? And that comes into play with the cascading part, because the text is actually underneath its li elements. And we can prove that this works really quickly by coming in here and seeing blue. And the cascading part is that the attribute color, or the style attribute color, is being applied to this element, and then it's being inherited by these guys.
Okay.
It cascades down to all the children.
Exactly, until it's overridden.
Gotcha.
You still with us, Nelson?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, just checking.
Well, I mean, I really love to
I know
sit
there's-
down and go over everything about CSS, but there's so...
Yeah, we've already gone just over an hour, so it's a good time to call it, because there's definitely been a lot of content covered here, which has been excellent. And we'll save stuff like weighting, I guess, for a little bit later, because that's also
Oh, yeah, that's very important.
very, very cool stuff. But Zach, do you have any questions? Or
No, I think
anything you wanna add?
I think we've done a good job of at least demonstrating the difference between HTML and CSS, and the kind of generic overview of how they can be applied.
Of course, I'm not going to be happy until he copies all that and pastes it into the validator. I mean, because we're supposed to do that, right?
We are.
Yes,
we are.
we are supposed to do this, actually. And I do on every production website that I launch.
So we want to make sure everybody gets into the habit of doing this.
Oh, this better validate.
Ta-da!
Oh, you win.
Very nice, very nice. Awesome. Okay, well, we'll wrap things up with this video. In the next episode, what do you think, Nelson? We'll start taking our first look at ASP.NET and
Yeah,
what it
I
is?
say we quickly go over some ASP.NET basics and maybe install MVC and show you what a sample project looks like.
Awesome. That sounds fantastic. All right. Well, thank you to our member sponsors. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
And with that, that will conclude this video. Thanks a lot, everyone.